Welcome to the very first episode of the Live Ready podcast, a podcast dedicated to sharing the knowledge you need to help you feel ready for taking on the different challenges in life. Each episode will be dedicated to a different type of challenge. This episode is all about food. My name is Patrick Charon, I am your host, and my guest today is Sucha Kumar. Sucha Kumar is a primal health coach who guides her community through ancestral eating, fasting, mixed movement modalities, and yoga. She has 18 years of mixed movement training and has experienced all the diets across the board, from being vegan to taking on the ultimate elimination carnivore diet, bringing her a plethora of knowledge with nutrition and food psychology. Through her company Blissed, she leads primal living retreats, camps, and movement intensives where the community is guided through fasting, movement, healing methods, and nature grounding. Blissed offers a variety of retreats, from the annual grounded retreat in Moab, Utah, to the Release and Ascend 72-hour fasting retreat that takes place in locations across the U.S. Be sure to also look out for pop-up primal movement events where you'll get a chance to connect with the community. So, though she does a lot of things, the main reason I wanted to have Sucha on today was because I first met Sucha a few years ago on social media, like many of us meet these days. And at the time, she was just coming out of being what we'll call a full vegan. She was exploring animal products for the first time in a long time, having lived the vegan lifestyle for a very long time. And over the years, I've seen her experiment and try different diets and really be very open about that journey, all the way up to maybe a few months ago, where she announced that she would be trying a full elimination carnivore diet, where she actually ate nothing but, or just about nothing but, ribeye steaks for 7 days straight. And I really wanted to know what that experience is like, because I feel like when it comes to nutrition, especially in today's world, we have too much information. It is so difficult to figure out what's the best way to eat for you. What works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another person. Now, there's a lot of different variables when it comes to figuring this out, and we dive into all kinds of things in this conversation. So if you're looking to figure out how to better eat for you, I highly recommend this conversation. I think you'll learn quite a bit. I know that I did. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Sucha Kumar. Hey, Sucha. So welcome to actually what is the very first episode of the Live Ready podcast. I'm really excited to have you here today. You and I connected a few years ago on what was then the Flow Tribe podcast. At that time, we talked a lot about primal living. We talked about movement. We talked about breathing. We talked about food. We talked about just about everything that can be said about primal living. The reason I wanted to bring you on today is because of your experiences with food. When we first met or first connected, if I remember correctly, you were primarily following a plant-based diet. In the last few years, you've experimented quite a bit with different diets, different ways of eating, and to the point where more recently you've adopted a carnivore diet, and now I think you're maybe somewhere else at this point. But I wanted to bring you on just because neither one of us is a scientist. We're not food scientists. We're not nutrition experts in the sense of macro and micronutrients and all that stuff. The reason I want to bring you on is because you're someone who's experimented. You're someone who's had experiences, and you're someone who's willing to kind of share what they know about the experience that they've had. I also know that you've led retreats where you lead people through certain ways of eating, and so you can also kind of learn from those experiences of the people that you've guided through this process. And that's the type of information I want people to have, because I think we live in a world now that's very confusing when it comes to food. There are so many labels, right? We have keto, we have paleo, we have vegan, we have plant-based, we have vegetarian, we have this, we have that. There's so many things that we can choose from. And from my own experience and the experience of the people around me, there is no one size fits all when it comes to food. What works for one person won't necessarily work for the other. So we're going to dive into all of that. But before we do, one thing, a ritual that I want to start on this podcast is I want to invite my guest and anybody who's listening that we take one long, deep breath together. I'm someone who really deeply believes in breath training and meditation. And I felt like if we could just close our eyes, take one long, deep breath together, it would be a really cool way for us to connect and to start this conversation. Okay, so let me just ask you to close your eyes. We're going to take a long, deep breath in. Hold that breath for 3, 2, 1, and then slowly exhale. Perfect. All right, Sucha. So how about we start by having you just introduce yourself and kind of take us back to when you and I first met, or maybe just let us know a little bit about your experience leading up to when we first met, following a plant-based diet. What was your experience like growing up? What were your experiences like at that time that led you to make that choice for yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Um, so I think in my entire life, I've always kind of had the personality of, exploring and experimenting with different things. And up until recently, around the time that we actually had our last conversation, was when it was really becoming clear that my fascination was with primal living and getting back to our roots. I've always had the focus and really prioritizing our health, our long term health. So, not just like dieting short term. That was never something that, although I've experienced, I just, from so much failure and realizing it was so detrimental to my mental health, it's something that I really wanted to explore as far as long term health. And then also the environment or our sustainability and earth consciousness has always been a driver for me. Um, Growing up, obviously in high school, that's when I really got a little bit more aware of the fact that diet or what we're eating can affect your physical appearance. And I think for many people tuning in, you might resonate with the fact that we did care a lot about our experiences and exterior, especially in middle school, high school, when we're just figuring out our personalities. We don't probably even have a good grasp of our consciousness and that, exploration yet. So for me at that time, I had kind of, put on some weight. I was just getting a little bit more food freedom because I had grown up with a little bit more restricted, eating. Like I wouldn't go out that much to restaurants because of my parents. They would make sure we always finished everything on our plate. So for me, going out to eat was really exciting and all these things. So I kind of just got really excited, and I was introduced to actually eating pescatarian, and I realized when I was a sophomore in high school, so around 15, I realized that I was able to cut out a lot of unhealthy food by just going pescatarian. Because unfortunately, a lot of unhealthy foods do have meat and basically animal foods involved. So, like, pepperoni pizza, for example, or hot dogs or hamburgers. These are all things that I kind of was able to avoid by going pescatarian. And I did see great results. And I pretty much maintained being pescatarian for a few years. When I was 18, 19, I got really intrigued with environmental sustainability. That's when I was first introduced, and people had mentioned the vegan diet and how amazing it was for environmental sustainability. But at that time, I was still just like, there's no way I could ever go vegan. But I definitely love challenging myself. That's always been something where I'm like, I just want to like show myself I can do it. And also that playfulness of experimentation, because when I first decided to go vegan, it wasn't for the long term. I was just kind of like, let's see how this goes. Um, so at age 19, I decided to go vegan after really diving into meat agriculture and how detrimental that was for our water resources, our environment, and then also realizing that there could actually be great health um, positives from eating a vegan diet. And luckily, the partner that I was with was like really great moral support because he decided to do it with me. And I think that can be really supportive when doing different diets, because it's definitely easier if the people around you are eating that same way. I was also just had moved to San Diego at that time, so there's a huge vegan community there, and it almost like kind of catapulted. And one thing that I will say, and we'll maybe touch on this later, is that I really think as humans, like we want to belong, like we want to feel a part of something. So I think the vegan community helped me feel like I was a part of something, especially moving to a new city. So that kind of definitely added to my passion as far as the plant-based community. And it felt like it ticked off all the boxes. Fast forward to around when we had our first conversation, and this was just a few months before I had traveled a few months to India and Thailand to do some yoga and Muay Thai training. And that was the first time I realized, like, whoa, tofu and broccoli is not sold all over the world in excess. And I was just like shocked because tofu and broccoli were probably like the main foods that I was eating. And I was also traveling pretty minimal, but I still made it a point to take my vegan protein powder with me all the way to the other side of the world. And I was like, this is like something's not feeling right. Because when I go to the grocery store, I was like, all of my normal foods aren't here, and the ones that were like shipped from far, far away. Something just didn't feel right. And because I wasn't really eating a lot of grains and legumes, it's just never really sat well with me. And legumes are basically like beans, for people who don't know, and grains that could fall into like rice, quinoa, all of those different things. They just never were drawn to me. And I did like to do a little bit more low carb. So because I wasn't resorting to those foods, and those foods are really big in Asian countries, there was only so many vegetable options and really no other plant protein options for me. So I slowly started to reincorporate some eggs and a little bit of seafood. And it was really just for me a temporary thing. I was like, I'm just here, I'm just going to do it. But it started to feel good. And then that kind of trickled into introducing a few other foods like chicken. And then as I had more salmon and eggs, I was like, whoa, I am seriously craving this. And that's actually around when we last had our conversation. So I'll kind of stop there. But that's why when I was still really focused on plant-based eating and I considered myself plant-based, but I was literally just dabbling in some other foods that were kind of speaking with me.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I had a very similar journey. But one thing you mentioned was pescatarian, just so people know that's
Yeah.
mostly you're primarily eating fish as a source of
Yes.
protein, right? So you're eating fish, you're eating seafood, anything from the sea, basically. I always
Yes.
thought pescatarian sounds a bit like a religion, but but yeah, it's primarily you're eating a lot of fish, a lot of seafood. It's a diet that I followed for many, many years. And I
Yeah.
also like what you said about high school. And it's interesting. I was thinking the other day, I'm a lot older than you are, but roughly 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the idea of diet was mostly because I want to lose weight. You know, someone who went on a
Yeah.
diet was primarily doing it because they wanted to lose weight or they had some sort of health issue that forced them to eat a certain way. Rarely did you hear about people, even athletes, eating for performance, eating for,
Yeah.
to better their
That's true.
lives, eating, young people thinking about what they're eating. Forget about it. You ate what was available. But now we know so much more, and that has a lot to do with science, but I think it also has to do with experience. I think it has to do with the options that are now available that were not available back then. But it's interesting that, again, a lot of people eat. It's still probably very true that a lot of people who change the way they eat are doing it for physical appearances. They're trying to find the best way to eat, not for their health necessarily, but that will give them the results that they want, right? And
Yes.
it's also interesting that what you said about travel, because I think that's something, and I remember a few years ago getting onto this Facebook conversations, and those always go really well, as we know, where people were arguing specifically about vegan versus meat eating diets, and it was getting really nasty. Like the comments, I know I
Yeah.
have a lot of friends that are vegan, plant-based eaters, and I think there is a difference to be said about a vegan versus someone who eats plant-based. I think vegan is really a
Yes.
lifestyle. And it's interesting also what you
Yeah.
said about community, that vegan does have a strong sense of community attached to it if you choose to adopt that lifestyle. But this person chimed in on what was getting to be a very nasty conversation between people and said this is a very first world conversation, in the sense that this is a guy who traveled
Yeah.
extensively around the world. He said there are so many parts of the world that just don't have an option. They eat chicken because that's
Yes.
all they can raise. They eat this because
Yeah.
that's all that's available. So let's be careful when we get really militant about the ways that we eat, because here, in some cases, we have options. And I'm not just saying North America, I'm saying specific people in North America, because even in North America, some local grocery stores, like there's not much, like what you said about
Yeah.
tofu and broccoli, like that becomes your staple, but some places just don't have those things available. So then what do? Do you not
Yeah.
eat? Right? Do you deprive yourself?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think of it globally, that sometimes what works here won't necessarily work there. So you talked about, so I just wanted to kind of fill in those little gaps. And you talked about how all of a sudden you were eating chicken, you were eating salmon, you were bringing in these animal-based products into your life, and you started to feel better. Now, did you feel bad before that? Or was it more like, oh, wait a minute, I felt pretty good, but now I feel better than I used to. So maybe there's something going on there. Is that what maybe triggered that desire to keep learning and to keep figuring out what was going on?
Yeah, that's a really good and complex question because at the time that I was vegan, I was so passionate and attached, and it was a part of my identity to be eating vegan and also, plant. I like to call myself plant-based, but I was eating a fully vegan diet, like not having honey or anything like that. But at that time, I just believed in it so much. And it was also when something is a part of your business. So at that time, I was running a lot of events, and it was always like classified as like only vegan food here. And so it feels like a responsibility that not only am I educating people on this, but I have to be thriving on this. There's like no possibility I can't, because I'm kind of like the spokesperson or the person representing. And not to go on a little tangent, but I do believe in the placebo effect and how powerful that is. And I really truly believe, above all of this diet stuff, like you can truly think your way into thriving or surviving or, reaching amazing levels of being. But I also believe that biology has like a really important factor in this. So to answer your question, for the 4 years I was vegan and even pescatarian, I did believe that I was thriving, especially while I was vegan. I was weightlifting a lot. I was what I would consider an athlete because I was training for multiple hours a day with really strong fitness and performance goals. However, I did not realize that a lot of the things that I had problems with were problems. I just normalized them. So just a few, just to, for my experience, just to name one of them was that I thought it was completely normal that every time I would eat, I would completely bloat up. And I'm not just talking about a little food baby. Like for me, it would be pretty intense. And I would feel super sleepy after. And everyone kind of normalizes like an afternoon schlump. And I don't experience that anymore. So for me, I thought that was totally normal. Also, and this is especially like for women, for me, I had a really irregular period cycle. And this was even after a few years after getting off birth control, which for me, I think is very detrimental for our hormones. But even after that and trying to heal so much, it was still, I was still really struggling with that. And if we look at health markers, your fertility, whether you're trying to have kids or not, just being fertile and having a healthy cycle is a really good indication that you are healthy or you're not healthy. So those are really important to look into, especially if you're a woman or if you're a guy with a woman who maybe wants to like spend more time caring about this. Um, for also, and I go through periods of like stress in my life, but I feel like it's pretty consistent waves. But I was just experiencing a lot of hair loss. And for the first time, I was just like, oh, this is like a lot because I've always had, long, thick hair growing up. That's also part of something that I like connected to as far as my identity goes. But it was the first time I was like, I feel like I'm losing like a lot more than normal, not just a small amount. Um, and so those are probably like the three biggest things for me that I was could completely normalize. I was like, these are all just normal things. It's probably stress. It's probably this. It's probably that. But everyone goes through this. And after experiencing, even just incorporating like eggs and fish back again, there was so much that started to subside, and I actually did start getting my period back, which that was probably one of the biggest indicators or signs for me that I'm going in the right direction, because I was like, okay, this is actually healthy for me.
Yeah, that's super interesting. But I also think you mentioned the word craving when you started to eat
Hmm.
meat again, you started to eat fish. And
Yes.
I think that's something we underestimate sometimes is that primal, and that's a word you and I like to drop a lot. So primal kind
Yeah.
of those urges that we have. And I had a very similar experience where I was, like I said, pescatarian for many years. And it was something that, as the main chef, I guess, in the family, we ate a lot of fish. And my son,
Yeah.
whenever he would go somewhere else, he would order whatever was on the menu that wasn't fish because he was so sick of eating it all the time.
Mm.
And then I said, you know what? I think it's unfair to you that I impose my way of eating on you. And he was maybe 10 at the time. And so I said, what I'm going to
Yeah.
do is I'm going to buy you one of those barbecue chickens, one of those rotisserie chickens at the store. And you can have that for dinner and I'll have my fish. And we were on our way home in the car and I was assaulted by the smell, but in such a positive way. By the time we got home, I swear to God, I was drooling. Like I was having this primal wolf experience where
Wow.
I said, I'm taking half of this thing. Like I just right there and then decided there's no way that this feeling is normal. Like I have to eat this chicken. And
Yeah.
it was that like and there was, a lot of ethical issues going on in my mind at the same time, like the reasons why I choose not to eat animals. But I was just like, there's something here. Like this voice,
Yeah.
this urge, this desire to eat this. There's something to that. And that was
Yeah.
kind of where I started to reintroduce it. And I've gone up and down and I've made all these different decisions. But now you mentioned that. So that's something I wanted to mention is sometimes cravings, we should
Yeah.
listen to our bodies. And I think
Yes.
that, what works for one, because I know people that follow a strict vegan diet are extremely healthy, very happy, and have nothing but positive things to say about it. And that is great for them. It did not work for me. I got very
Yeah.
sick. I got sick a lot. And just like you, I thought, oh man, it's one of those things. I just keep getting the flu. It must be like a weird
Hmm.
year. Maybe these viruses are stronger than usual. And then all of a sudden, I
Yeah.
reintroduced fish and eggs into my diet. And lo and behold, I stopped getting sick. And that was an immediate
Yes.
marker for me. It's like, oh, well, that is pretty obvious. It's not coincidental.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people
Yeah.
have similar experiences. And so, other than just that kind of feeling of health and seeing all of these things happen, what were some of the struggles, I would say, because you made a choice? Like you said, you had this identity. You identified as vegan. You built a business around being a vegan. I'm assuming you had
Yeah.
members of your community that were
Oh, yeah.
militant vegans. And I use the word militant only because I think of all the ways of eating, that community can be very militant and very
Yeah.
unwilling to bend to a certain extent when
Yeah.
it comes to their beliefs. And that's, to each our own. Um,
Yeah.
but I'd be curious to know how that transition went for you, because I think for a lot of people, sometimes we struggle with that, whether it's eating or something else. But sometimes we forbid ourselves from doing certain things, even though they may be good for us, just because we're afraid of what the backlash will be, whether it's our families, whether it's our friends, whether it's our community. I think a lot of people would like to maybe eat a certain way or live a certain way, but they're afraid of what the consequences of those choices may be. So I'd be curious to know how that transition went for you. So you came back, you reintegrated yourself into your community. How did it affect your business? And what are ways that you were able to kind of navigate that space?
Yeah. Whew, okay. So this is probably why 2021 I feel like was such an informative year for me, because it's when I decided to kind of go all out with my truth and like where I was at, because I just am so big on being transparent. I always share that on, Instagram and my stories on, the retreats and offerings I do. But I did not realize, and it was really crazy to reflect on how I was as a vegan, even though I wouldn't consider myself a militant vegan. If I saw someone who is even still like plant-based and maybe would have eggs or seafood and like, once in a while, there was still a lot of judgment that came up for me. And I was like, oh, well, they're still, they don't like they're still not 100% vegan. Or I've had people try to have open-minded conversations with me about how vegan might not be the only solution for the planet, and how there's other, modalities like regenerative farming. And I remember just not even wanting to accept that information, because in my head, it like I wasn't even able to be open. I was always cordial with talking, and I've seen some conversations and actually have gotten messages that are very not cordial. But it was just I just to share that, because I really do understand, and I'm so grateful for this journey, because I understand what it's like now to be on that like militant side of veganism, and then also on the other side where it's just like, wow, they just really don't get it, or they're not willing to look, on the other perspective. So around when we talked, it was pretty crazy, because that was when I was starting to, incorporate animal foods, and I felt that like unwavering craving and desire. Like, I remember I hadn't even really had red meat my entire life, maybe like a Carl's Jr. or In-N-Out burger growing up, but really through middle school and up, no red meat at all. So when I had like a bite of steak, I was literally salivating, and I was like, what is wrong with me? I wanted to deny that part of me so much. And I was like, what's going on? Why does every part of my being want to like eat red meat right now? This is crazy. Um, so there was a lot of guilt, I would say, for especially the first 6 months of this journey. And I would share snippets of it, because I, again, really like to be transparent. It's never something that I tried to hide, but I definitely didn't share like the extent of how much I wanted to eat right off the bat, because of course I remember I posted this story of like Wagyu, because it was my first time trying Wagyu, which is like a really like specific kind of beef. Um, and I had someone in the vegan community respond, and they were like, "Wow, they make vegan Wagyu," and I was like, "No," like I was just, because I mean these days they make vegan everything, so that's not like a far off question. But I was like, "No, it's real," and the response was like, "Oh, that's a bummer," and I was like, dang, because like for me, that was such a beautiful, exciting experience of tasting something so delicious and it being so satiating. So it started with a few responses of that, like just surprises from the vegan community, because they definitely were watching my stories and my social media. I was like, oh, like I didn't know that when did you start eating meat? Just kind of like surprises, but more so just like disapproving and disappointed. And eventually, when I really realized that, like, okay, not only am I eating animal foods, but I think red meat is about to be a staple of my diet, because it was doing so much healing for me. I had to share more. And of course, for me, I don't just take things like a little bit. Like, I love to go all the way. And I also did a lot of research on the ultimate elimination diet, which is where you're basically just eating full on carnivore. I'm not strict carnivore anymore, but I did that for almost like the entire summer of 2021 and a little bit longer. And of course, I shared that, but that's where I realized like a lot of people unfollowing. Facebook community we talked about is very vocal, and it clicked to me after sharing a few posts that I was like, wow, all the people in my community are people that I built while I was really pushing towards veganism and doing all these vegan events. So the audience that I'm communicating with is like, of course I'm going to get triggering responses. I'm literally triggering everybody in my community right now who especially people who are plant-based and vegan. So that was a lot for me to process, because there was so much defensiveness that came up, and this entire experience has been like a very spiritual grounding experience for me, because later I was like, wait, I was there. Like, I literally remember all of the thoughts that are there coming up with. I was there. Maybe I didn't type it out the same way that they did, but I was there. And so it just started with that. But eventually, I actually got to the point where even the retreats that I was hosting, I was like, I'm not going to offer a vegan retreat if that's not my truth anymore. And this is something I feel strongly enough that I've experienced myself that I really want to bring forth to people. So that shifted. But of course, again, my community was so much focused on plant-based eating that I definitely realized, wow, even my marketing and the way I reach out to people is going to be really different now because I'm no longer talking to the same plant-based community. I'm literally basically selling like a retreat that is mostly animal-based. So it was definitely a process. And I honestly think I'm still kind of in the process of figuring it out, but I've gotten so much peace with myself because I realized like this is just going to keep triggering people because right now it's not just the community, it's like the national push or even international push on people is to go more plant-based. So of course I'm really going against the grain of, you know, on a global level what is being pushed onto people right now.
Oh, wow. There's so much there. I think what you're saying too is there's this, and I think this goes for so many things in society right now, is we've polarized everything, right? You're either
Yeah.
plant-based or you're the enemy. You're either, and then the
Yes.
carnivore hunter, I think hunting carnivore that kind of has a pretty big shared overlap, will constantly make fun of plant-based, right? Like the amount
Yeah.
of, when I was eating vegan or avoiding meat, I got called all kinds of names from people
Yeah.
where I wasn't a real man and blah blah blah, and it's really funny to me. Like it's just such a weird. Why do you take so much identity to the way that you eat? Like you
Yeah.
make your choice, I'll make my choice, and I can understand to a certain extent that if you believe that, and I do believe that there's a lot of cruelty in the meat industry. I honestly, and that's the reason I stopped eating meat for a long time.
Yeah.
I think there are ways to navigate that. I think there are ways to search for sources of meat that are that come from better places.
Yeah.
And I could probably have a massive conversation about all of that. I don't think we have time to get into all of that, but I think it's more what I'm admiring about you. And again, I'm admiring it from afar as someone who follows you on social media. But first of all, it is your willingness to share. I think that transparency, the good and the bad, is you, as where sometimes you just see the highlights, right? And that's a trap that we all fall into with social media, is we see the highlights of what a person is, how they represent themselves. Like I could choose to make everyone believe whatever I want on social media about myself. Doesn't mean that's what's happening in real life. But with you, it was so much of the ups and the downs and the changes and the this and the that, that it was almost like, this is really what she's doing. Like she's not really high. I'm sure that it's not 100% transparent because I don't think anybody should be. But it was really seeing how you were willing to make those choices, make those changes, document what was going on, and then adapt. And, in my own experience in the past year and a half, I've gone through some chronic health issues and things that have come up. And I knew that somehow nutrition had to be involved, or at least I thought it was. I'm still not clear as to what role it played. All I know is that I tried this. All of a sudden, I found this rhythm of eating that really worked for me. I was like, okay, done. I'm just not gonna mess with it. Like I found my way of eating. Some of it is animal based, some of it is plant based. I eliminated the elimination diet you talked about, which I think is very difficult for a lot of people. But get rid of a lot and then slowly start reintroducing a few things at a time, because there'll be very clear indicators like, whoa, okay, like for me, cruciferous vegetables are off the list. Like I clearly know now that if I eat broccoli, cauliflower, any of those, it really gives me, I get pretty upset stomach, and it's very clear to me now. And there's like, it's just, okay, that's off the list. So be it,
100%,
and I think the same can be said about a lot of things. But we need to be willing to make those choices. We need to be willing to experiment for ourselves, right? Because what works for me does not work for my wife, and what works for her doesn't work for me. And then my son, well, he's 15 and he can eat anything he wants because he's growing, and that won't always be the case, But I'd be curious to know, so ribeyes every day. That's intense. That's really intense. And I'd be curious to know, what were some of the challenges with that? Never mind the challenges of, I'm guessing at some point it's like, oh, I can't believe I'm going to eat another steak again. But more physically, what was that kind of transition like? Did you see immediate changes? Was there a dip before there was a climb back up to feeling good? Did you feel really bad before you felt good again? Like, I'd be really curious to know what that transition was like for you.
Yeah. I'm gonna give like a little context and as compact as possible for people who aren't familiar. So last summer, I decided to go fully carnivore, to really experience that. I mean, animal based, like I would have a few fruits and some honey once in a while and some yogurt, but really you would call it the carnivore diet. And I had seen, what's referred to as the lion diet, where people are literally just having red meat. And I chose like the ribeye. If you're familiar with cuts of meat, it is kind of one of the most delicious cuts of meat. But another reason why it's so satisfying for people is because it probably has like a very high fatty ratio to the amount of protein. So very fatty, but a lot of protein, of course, too, because it's red meat. And not to get deep into it, but if you're thinking about how you're using energy, we know that the basis of keto is that like you don't necessarily need a lot of carbs, but you definitely need protein, which is a building block, and then also fats you can thrive off of. So getting enough fats was my goal, which is why I was like, I think I can do ribeye only, and ribeyes are also delicious. The other little bit of context I want to give, maybe we'll touch on this a little bit more, is that one of the things that I was always struggling with in my life was actually some disordered eating and binge eating. So even while I was vegan, one thing that I really try to hide and suppress was that I just never felt satiated. I felt physically full because the literal food would fill me up, but there was like a undenying like I was just not satiated, and so I would keep binge eating, and then that creates a habit in your brain. So that's a whole nother conversation. But eating red meat was the first time, and even some eggs and salmon itself was the first time I got so satiated. So I was like, that was actually my reasoning for wanting to go fully into carnivore. Wasn't just actually for the physical, because definitely, getting shredded, building lean muscle is a goal of mine, but it was really for the mental health because I was just still struggling a lot with, sugary foods or treats and stuff being very triggering for me, and then wanting to kind of binge and cheat and different things. So that's the context. I decided to do a full week of just ribeyes, definitely investment, but I think it was probably one of the best investments I've ever made in my life. A lot of people like to do retreats, which I love as well, and I host them. But this retreating yourself at home and just eating ribeyes can be an amazing retreat in and of itself. So this was very insightful experience because first of all, there's arguably no other food in the whole wide world or cut of meat that you could solely survive off of. So if you just think about it for a second, like think of one food that maybe you could completely survive off of. If that was a plant food, like maybe nuts because there's fats and proteins and a little bit of carbs involved, but that can be really inflammatory. And I think there is a little bit of a reason why a lot of people actually can't do nuts. So as far as meat goes, chicken, super lean. Some of the other foods might not just be as satiating to eat all the time, but a steak, you could probably and quite literally live off of just a steak. And so that itself was just like, whoa, we're in a world where like there's so much advertisements and like things pulling at our attention for this new food and this new snack and this new like whatever and healthy form of a snack, but just being able to be like, wow, I just need this one food, so simple. In my head, it was like the most mental peace that I had ever experienced in my life, because the next meal I was thinking about, I wasn't thinking about this thing or this thing. I was just like, I already know I'm going to get the ribeye. It is the most satisfying food for me. And I know I'm getting all of the nutrients I need just with this one type of food. So that was very, very, it was just an incredible experience. And obviously that's not something that I probably would want to sustain forever. I'm a foodie. I love trying out new things. I'm in a really good place now where I do kind of eat a lot of different things, but being able to come to that baseline and being like, all right, this is my baseline. This is all I need to not just survive, but thrive. I could thrive off of this. Now everything I'm adding in is super intentional, but I have my foundation. So that was probably the biggest takeaway for me. And just now I have such a minimal refrigerator. I've seen some people's refrigerators now and I freak out because mine used to be like that when I was plant-based, and I had like 10 different sauces and then 20 different vegetables, most of them that are not even in season or from this country. And now I'm just like, wow, I just have a few foods. It's so basic, and it's literally almost kind of like fasting, but if you're still eating, this is as minimal and kind of peaceful you can get with your mind.
Yeah, that's really interesting that sometimes we have this analysis paralysis, right? When it comes to food where there's too many options. Like sometimes my
Yeah.
wife and I joke like, oh, what's for dinner tonight? Like we hate asking that question because it means we have to think about it.
Yeah.
We have to figure out, okay,
Yes.
can we just eat the same things over and over again? And often I'm good with that. Like what you said about this one food that I could just eat. I think for me, it's salmon. I think salmon plays a bit of
Yeah.
that similar role because it's so fatty. It is something I could probably eat. I mean, at some point I'd be like, okay, I need something else. But physically, I feel like if I ate salmon every day, I'd be fine. Like I'd be
Yeah.
completely fine because there's such a
Totally.
complete spectrum of nutrients there, right? Especially if it's coming
Yeah.
from a good source. Um, and I think I'd like to dive into that a little bit, which is where did those ribeyes come from? Because again, I don't want to go too deep into this rabbit hole of factory farming and all that, but that is a huge point. You know, meat, there is a cost. There is an environmental cost to the raising of meat. I have friends who are hunters, and, you know, I met a man many, many years ago who was probably the most ethical hunter I've ever met, where his killing of an animal was a spiritual experience. Like it was an
Hmm.
Avatar when, you know, she kills the animal and she thanks him for its life. And that
Yeah.
was his approach to hunting. And I was like, and until then, I never thought of hunting as something sustainable, as something ecological, as people having those relationships with the animals that they were hunting. But this guy showed me a whole different way of seeing that. And I thought, and then he offered me a big piece of what he had hunted recently. And I said, absolutely, yes. And I brought home a big chunk of moose. It was a big chunk of moose.
Yeah.
And my wife is like, what is this? Mr. I don't eat meat. I'm like, this is different meat. This is not what you'll find at the grocery store. I know where this came from. I know this animal never suffered a day in its, well, maybe it did somehow, but had nothing to do with the way it was
Yeah.
killed. Um, and I knew that the energy behind this meat was as pure as it can possibly be. And so that made a huge difference for me all of a sudden. And I was like, unfortunately, it's not readily available all the time, you know? And I think
Yeah.
for some people, I completely understand that draw towards hunting and sustaining their nutrition through hunting because of that reason. Like it
Yeah.
was, I ate that with zero guilt, you know, and it was strange for me because I always, even now, if I eat chicken from the store, if I eat anything from the store that's animal based, I eat it with guilt. I eat it, but I eat it
Mm.
with tons of guilt. And
Yeah.
so I'd be curious to know, like, where are you sourcing your meat from? And just to give people a bit of an idea that there are options, there are different ways to approach this type of diet. So could you maybe dive into that a little bit?
Totally. Yes. This is probably one of the aspects of eating that I'm the most passionate about because I truly believe the way we eat directly impacts the environment. And if we take it back to our ancestors, we literally were living in harmony with the planet and the earth, and we're definitely out of touch. We're out of touch in the aspect of eating meat, but also plants and vegetables and fruits because we're eating stuff that's out of season. We don't realize that there's so much that takes to even yield a few strawberries. Like there's actually animals being killed in the process just to protect the organic strawberries if you're not using pesticides and, you know, chemicals that are naturally killing the animals. And then, of course, factory farming is absolutely horrible as well because the actual animals are not living and eating what their ancestors ate, which, you know, for cows or red meat was grass. And they're eating, you know, grains and different things. So, with all of that being said, for me, one of the biggest, um, you know, game changers for me as far as eating meat was really getting in peace with, you know, just the way I was eating, because the guilt was there so much. And I feel that with so many people. And I think one of my biggest messages is actually to release the guilt, because you could eat anything, but if you're feeling guilty, you're not even going to digest and absorb the nutrients in the right way. So there's something, just to touch on it briefly, which is called regenerative agriculture. And that basically means that the animals and the plants that are being raised on that farm are coexisting together. So it's not just a bunch of cows in, you know, a fence. It's cows, chickens, pigs. It's different plants being raised, and then of course the grass, and they're basically mimicking and literally regenerating the earth how we once, were on this planet. So if you guys look at like migration patterns, we used to have millions and millions of bison migrating across the entire continental US and even through Canada and Central America. So these are literally like plowing and tilling the soil as they're, migrating, and that's literally regenerating the soil. We have such dead soil now, and monocrop agriculture is basically when you're only growing one plant for miles and miles and miles and miles, which is completely unnatural, right? So it's unnatural to have avocados being sold when it's super cold in the winter, or a lot of these other fruits and vegetables that we have. Even if you go into a Costco, I remember I used to always get my power greens, and you're just getting bags and bags of power greens. But how did that even come into existence? Because if you try to grow spinach or kale in your backyard, 100% it's going to be nibbled on and eaten and trampled on and stuff. So how do you get these perfect leaves mass produced? There's something missing in all of this. So as I educated myself more on regenerative, that is how I chose to source a lot of my meats from. And there's variations to all of this, and I would say nobody's perfect. So, of course, if I go out to eat once in a while, most places are not sourcing the best, highest quality meat or eggs. But there are some places that go out of the way to do that. And those are definitely like my favorite restaurants or places that I try to go to. So there's a lot of different terms here, and I'm not going to go into each of them in detail, but to give you an idea, there are specific regenerative farms that you can actually get from. So that could be your local farmer if you get to know your area and community. There's also bigger farms and companies that source from regenerative farmers that are great for shipping. And that's what I usually do, because I travel a lot, it's a little bit easier for me to keep it frozen if I'm doing like ground bison or ground beef. And then occasionally I'll do, wild boar. I'll do venison, which is something that I've been incorporating that I feel really, really good with. Venison's kind of like deer or elk. And then if I am somewhere local where I have access, where I can actually meet the farmer, a lot of farmers markets do this, and that's a great option as well. And then, if I'm getting eggs, making sure they're pasture eggs, really looking for all of those signs. And the more you dive into this, you'll be able to kind of learn. And then, of course, meeting yourself where you're at financially. Um, we're at a time and place where we're trying to like look for the cheapest deal with everything. And I definitely did that too, but this was just a commitment that I was making for myself. And I said, if I'm actually really focused on saving the planet, investing more in my food is actually a way to do that. It's a way of voting with my dollar. So, yes, I definitely invest a good amount in my food, but sourcing from a regenerative farm, you're literally regenerating the soil, which directly has to do with the climate and then the animals and how they're killed. So, I really strongly believe, from everything that I've looked into, one of the best ways you can benefit your health and the environment is by putting more of your dollars towards that. So that's kind of like how I choose to source. One of the brands that I really like ordering from is Force of Nature. When I was also doing a road trip through the US, I stopped by White Oak Pastures in Bluffton, Georgia, which is really cool to visit. They have a really incredible big farm, and you can not only just, order different types of meats from them, which are all regenerative and grown there. They only sell what they have available too, so they're not trying to like force the chickens or the pigs or the whatever, like they're only selling what's available. And what I also really like to do is this concept of eating nose to tail. So I can dive into that later if you'd like, but basically you're eating all parts of the animal and you can actually buy from them like 1/8 of a cow or 1/4 of a cow. So you're not just selectively choosing a specific cut, they're giving you like legitimately a whole part of the cow, which I think is as primal as we can get in this day and age, unless you're actually going out and hunting.
Yeah, and there's something I definitely want to just touch on that you mentioned is the idea of availability. I think that,
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned earlier about that Facebook conversation that I was privy to, some of us have this choice, some of us don't. You know, there's a lot of people who might listen to this or just look at the nutrition landscape and see, wow, I would love to eat like that. I just can't. I can't afford it. I don't have it available to me in my community. I know that in many communities in the US, certain stores just don't have, like, for example, when I was living in California, finding pasture raised, grass fed was, I mean, any grocery store had multiple selections
Yeah.
of this. There was plenty of options. Why? Because people wanted it, because it was in demand. But then, you know, I moved around a lot, and in different parts of the US, that availability is not the same everywhere. In some cases, I have to go to a specialized store and pay twice as much for that same thing that cost me half the cost in another part of the country. And another example is also, you know, when you talk about greens or you talk about the things that are out of season, there's a big problem right now because of COVID, which is things aren't getting shipped. Right? There's a
Yeah.
supply chain issue. I went to the grocery store the other day and the entire greens section, which is those prepackaged like spinaches and lettuces and all that, gone,
Mm-hmm.
empty.
Yeah.
Like I cannot buy spinach. It's just not available in the leaf form, in the
Yeah.
packaged form. There's no spinach to be had. There's very little lettuce to
Yeah.
be had. Why? Because it's the middle of winter where I am. So obviously all of this
Yeah.
stuff is shipped from a different part of the country. So there's a cost to all of these things. There's availability issues. And so I want to be recognized. I want to recognize that. I don't want people to think that we're having this conversation and saying this is the best way. This is the only way. Look, it's more for me
Totally.
is to say, if you have the option,
Yes.
consider these things, you know, consider where
Yeah.
your meat comes from, consider where, and also be acknowledgeable of other people's situations. Right? Let's respect that we don't all have the same choices. We don't all have the same availabilities. We don't all have the same resources in order to eat the way that we might want to eat. You know, just eating
Yeah.
organic can be really complicated and very expensive. Or in some stores, there's just nothing available. Like you have this tiny
Yeah.
little section of organic fruits and vegetables, and it's not what you like. Well, I guess I'll just buy the ones that aren't organic because that's all I can eat right now. So I just want
Yeah.
to recognize that. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I would really just like to touch a little bit, and we might actually do a whole other episode on this if you're up to it, fasting.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about food, fasting, I think, is something that I've been interested in. I've experimented with a little bit, not nearly as much as you have. I think that it's really interesting that you've not only done it for yourself quite a bit, but you've also led retreats where you invite people to do this together, which I think is really cool. Because of you, I tried my first 3-day fast last year. It was an educational experience, not necessarily a very positive one. I don't know that I did it properly. I think I didn't prepare myself in the right way. My body just had, I made it for 2 days. By day 3, I just felt really bad and decided that that was it. Experiment over. One thing I do now practice is time restricted eating. And that's become something that I love. This idea of what they call intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, meaning that you will eat within an 8-hour, for me, it's an 8-hour window where I eat and 16 hours where I do not, which means if I have dinner at 6, I don't eat till 10 the next morning, which is basically skipping breakfast, you know, which is also, you know,
Yeah.
something that it sounds like it's something that's easy for some people. For me, it was always very difficult. But what I love about it, and especially that, is it's discipline. It's just for those few hours in the morning, I'm deciding to put off this thing that I really want. I wake up hungry. I want to eat right now. No, I'm going to force myself to wait. It gives me a sense of control. It gives me a sense of um, just discipline, I think is the right word. And it's just putting off this thing that I want. And the more often I do that, the more in control I feel, the more at peace I feel. But I've also noticed my body tends to metabolize food a little bit better, because then I'll eat and then a few
Yes.
hours later I'm hungry again, and a few hours later I'm hungry again, but in a good way, not in a starving way, just like, okay, I'm ready to eat again. I'm ready to eat again. And I found that my body just kind of got into this really cool rhythm, and I really enjoy eating this way more than I ever
Yeah.
have. Maybe it's also because what I'm eating is a little bit different than what it used to be. But I'd love to know what got you into fasting, and and how you approach it now, where you're at in your life today.
Yeah. Um, the control and discipline is for sure huge. And I love to lead with that. And I think discipline and control especially the word discipline seems like super strict and black or white. And it's kind of like looked down upon or kind of categorized for just one person. But I think there's a lot of power to discipline. And I always have this like kind of motto that I've meditated on, and it's the fact that discipline gives you freedom. Discipline gives you true freedom of life. And I am a yogi at heart. So yoga or yogic philosophy has really led me the more and more I've done training. And in yoga, there's two big principles. There's abhyasa, which means continual practice. So kind of like your ritual every day or the discipline, right? And then there's vairagya, which is detachment. So letting go of what's no longer serving you. And fasting has actually been both for me in so many different aspects. And of course, there's so many scientific amazing benefits like neuroplasticity, autophagy, ketosis, all of these like different terms. And those are all great. And I definitely feel like I've experienced a lot of those, but there's only so much that you can scientifically track. And I'm just at a place where I'm not trying to track my food. I'm not trying to attach a screening monitor to me. It just doesn't serve me really
You're
well,
not
and I
blood
really
testing
want to
4 times a
lead.
day? No.
No, not testing for ketones, anything. I just want to really lead with how I'm feeling. And of course, like we can go through phases where we get obsessive. Like I did that with like ketosis, and I was like, how do I like make sure I'm in a state of ketosis? But I'm at a good place now. And fasting has really been that for me. And I mentioned before, as far as mental health and healing my relationship with food. And that's truly what got me so entranced with this practice. It started with my inspiration was I used to work at a neuroscience clinic in La Jolla and San Diego, and they were focused on concussion and Alzheimer's. So super random, but my background's in marketing, so I was helping them with educational outreach. And I remember the head neuropsychiatrist who ran the place. His name's Dr. Muhammad Ahmed, and he was a huge inspiration. But he specifically would tell me, he's like, "Whoa, like I was testing out with these stem cells. Did you know that like just doing a 24-hour fast weekly can like significantly make your brain more plastic?" And we were kind of just nerding out about the brain stuff, and I was still not fully grasping that. And I was also at a place where I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but I would never fast for 24 hours voluntarily. Like, why would I do that? um and fast forward to maybe like 2 years later, and at this time I was kind of dabbling with intermittent fasting. And I actually got a buddy of mine who I was at work with to actually do a full 24-hour fast with me daily. So again, like that accountability partner, whether it's a certain way of eating or fasting, can be huge, especially if you're living with someone. If someone's eating at a different time, that can be really tempting. So we were at work together, so it was really nice to just have that partner. We'd spend all day working together. But fast forward to when I did my 300-hour teacher training in India, I picked up this random yoga book, and it was talking about fasting, but this was like ancient text, and I was like, this is crazy. Like this has been a practice forever. That's when things started clicking. And I remember the specific line was like, even just having a grain of rice starts secreting the same digestive enzyme. So even just having a grain of rice, whether you're just having a little snack, you're still signaling your body that you're about to have like a full-on meal. So your body is still going to go through that entire energetic process. And I was like, wow, our energy is really sacred. And I didn't view it from that lens. So there were so many different things in my life that started showing me fasting and how healing it was from different layers. And then I started really getting called into using it for my own healing. And this is something I've meditated a lot. And I think if we all tune in, we kind of can get those answers within us. But for me, that mindset of scarcity was always really big, kind of embedded from my childhood upbringing, as far as like, finish your plate of food, don't waste it. Like, we grew up poor, like all of these things. And so for me, I just was never, if there was a plate of food in front of me, even at a restaurant where it's like a huge plate of food, I'd finish it all. Or if there was like chips and salsa, which is literally just meant to snack on, like I felt like I had to eat it. And it was just, that definitely like led into the binging and all of the things that are intertwined. But with fasting, you're voluntarily choosing to not eat. And you could say this is one of the highest meditative practices, or that practice of detachment that we've talked about, vairagya, and abhyasa, the continual practice. So as I dove more into kind of researching fasting, you realize that you have your human brain, which is your prefrontal cortex, and your animal brain, which is like, I need food all the time, I'm in survival. And the really confusing thing is that we're in this world where we have food in abundance, but we still have our animal brain that wants to survive. So the biggest thing with fasting was kind of signaling myself like, I am safe. Food is always there for me. And that premeditation and guidance is really important. And that's why like doing a longer fast or something that I feel like is so supportive when you're with people, because it's really all about how we're signaling our brain. Our body can totally handle it. It's amazing for us, but our brain and how our animal brain specifically works is it will do anything to help us survive. If we're not signaling safety, then we're going to think fasting is literally like, why would I do that? And now it feels so beautiful because every bite of food I have is like celebration. I feel like abundance and all of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think again, I think with fasting, and the reason I had done intermittent fasting many times, I did one or two 24-hour fasts, and I felt that was pretty easy because you don't sleep hungry. With the 24-hour fast, I think, you have dinner and then there's dinner coming the next day. So there's no point where you're going to bed hungry. And to me, that was the struggle. Was by day 2, I had one of the worst sleeps I've ever had. It just, I kept waking up and I was hungry. And then I just started getting like cramping, and it was the cramping that started to scare me a little the next day. Like that morning, I was just like bent over and I just felt like, I don't know that this is very good for me at this point. And so, but the thing is, I think doing it by myself, and I did my research and all that, but you can't know until you do it, and that's, I think this whole podcast has been about. It's about experience things for yourself. And I would want to try it again, but I think I would love to do it with other people. I would love to do it with someone who's been through it and be like, oh yeah, the cramping phase. Yeah. Wait, don't worry. That's going to stop. Like, it's like going through a psychedelic experience by yourself. It can be really intense if there's no one there to be like, no, it's normal. It's okay. You're going to be fine. Like, there's experiences like that can be very intense if you're by yourself. And I was completely alone. My family was gone, which is why I did it, because if they were around eating all day, it would have been really hard for me. I thought this was the best way. I made it into as spiritual an experience as I could. I did have some incredible meditations in that fasted state. I did feel that like there were so many positives. And I still lasted 2 days. Like, it wasn't like, I still gained a lot of positive from it. And I felt like I failed like somehow because I didn't make it the full 3 days. But is that a rule? Like, do I have to do 3 days? You know what I mean? But I think I love what you said. And I love what you said also about how that single grain of rice will trigger so much because it's the body preparing for food, right? It's the body. There's this whole process. And that was always what fascinated me about fasting was that system never turns off. That digestive system, that food intake system and elimination system, they're always working. And fasting is the only time you'll give that system a break. And then what happens? I've heard incredible stories of people who've done 7-day fasts and this detoxification process, the things that start coming out of their body. It's disgusting to talk about, but it's also real. you know, and a friend of mine, she's like an Olympic athlete who went through this naturopathic training, and she did this 7-day fast, and she was describing what was happening on day 5. And I was like, oh my goodness, like amazing. And this is a very healthy person, you know, and to find out. So I'm not going to dive into any of those things, and we do need to start wrapping up. But I think I think if anything, fasting also, the concept of this podcast is Live Ready, which is all about, you know, acquiring the knowledge that you need to feel ready for fill in the blank. And in this case, I think with fasting is feel ready for what if I don't have any food? What if I don't have access to food? What if I go hungry for a little while? And what I loved learning was, hey, I don't need to eat just because my brain is telling me eat. It's okay to delay that gratification. It's okay to delay that food. I'm not going to pass out. I can still perform. I can still go out into the world. So that's one thing that I really appreciated. And I think also what you've shared today about just experimenting with the way that you eat, you know, and feeling ready for change, feeling ready to take control of your nutrition. Don't necessarily believe everything you read. Don't adopt a certain way just because it works for one person and you assume that it'll work for you. Be willing to experiment, be willing to make your own choices, be willing to do some research, be willing to try things, be willing to fail, be willing to say, wow, that did not work for me. You know, even if I want it, even if I attach myself to a belief system, maybe it's just not the one for me. And I need to be willing to accept that. And I need to be willing to try things for myself and just figure out what's best for me. So Sucha, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your experience, for sharing your obvious passion with everything that you do. Obviously, I'll make sure that everything is linked in the notes in the different places this podcast will appear. But I think as a final question, is there any message that you would like to share before we go?
Yeah, I mean, a big thing that I mentioned earlier before was like really, you know, walking your path and not feeling guilty about it. I know that's so hard, and I know that it's literally in our innate human nature to want to belong to a tribe or a culture or whatever that is, you know, and so being able to really tap in and acknowledging the phases, because you'll hear a lot that people say, you know, follow your intuition, intuitively eat, intuitively move. But how do you even know what is intuitive for you until you've done the extremes? For me, I had to go full vegan. I had to go full carnivore. I had to follow a fasting schedule strictly to get to a place where I am now, which is primarily animal based, to completely whole food eating, no supplements, you know, moving in a way every day that I'm just feeling called to. I have no fasting schedule anymore. It's literally just intuitive for me. Some days I eat earlier, some days I fast all day and eat one meal, and some days I feel called to do a longer fast. But I had to go through all of that. And definitely because I put myself out there, I got a lot of feedback from people that I didn't even ask for. However, it was beautiful to be able to share that experience. And also, it was a practice for me to let go of the guilt, because I've had so many people reach out to me saying, hey, like I started eating meat again and this has felt amazing. Hey, thank you for sharing your story. Like I've been having to hold this back because my husband or my wife is vegan of so many years, whatever that might be. But really try to tap into yourself, because again, you have all the answers, and also use like the discipline and the letting go as a tool rather than something that feels like you have a lot of resistance towards. Invite that in and just know that that's part of your process.
Amazing. Sucha, thank you so much for taking the time, and I can't wait for us to connect again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.